Today is Holocaust Memorial Day. It's an important day to reflect on terrible events of what happened many years ago, but also to think about people across the world, including those in Israel who suffered the awful attacks on the 7th of October 2023. I was this morning at Islington Town Hall listening to youngsters who had learnt about members of their family and what the members of their family had been through. It was a very moving occasion, and it is something that must never be forgotten. 6 months ago, this committee put out a report about the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and it included a section on Lebanon. And what we'd really like to do is look at what's happened in the intervening period. And we are particularly mindful of the fact that Lebanon, we think, gets overlooked too often, given what is happening in Syria and in Israel and Palestine. And it all deeply affects Lebanon. So we wanted to take this opportunity to learn more about it and to have an open session, which is also available for the public to be able to hear. We've got 3 really good witnesses. Thank you all very much for coming. Would you like to introduce yourselves for the record? Should we start with you, Chris?
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Chris Doyle. I'm the Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding.
Hello, I'm Lina, Khatib. I am an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, and I also work for a company called Extract as Principal Analyst, focusing on the geopolitics of the world.
I'm Daniel Levy. I'm the President of the US Middle East Project.
Great. So, President Owen and Prime Minister Nawaf Salam have now been in office for about a year. And I wondered if you could perhaps begin with telling us about how's it going, how stable and successful is the government, and perhaps also, Lina, if I could begin with you, can you also perhaps give us some information about how the economy is doing as well?
Thank you. Yes, it's been a year since this milestone government came into power in Lebanon. The reason why I call it a milestone government is because until 2025, Lebanon had been under Iranian and Syrian Assad regime supervision, to put it mildly. And this was the first time in almost half a decade that Lebanon has been able to have a president and a prime minister that were not pre-selected by Iran or the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. So this is a really transformational government for Lebanon. With that, of course, come very high expectations. As we know, the economy in Lebanon had started collapsing in 2019 and has not really fully recovered. And this government is meant to address that. One of the things that they have been able to do recently is make some progress on the financial gap situation with the banking system in Lebanon, which will enable Lebanon to finally be able to get funding from the IMF. This is a big step forward because there had been no movement on that front for many years. This predates the arrival of this government. But external aid from, for example, Gulf countries is not forthcoming. There are promises and pledges, but this is not really happening. So at the moment, the country is still very much dependent on remittances, dependent on individual endeavors, and maybe with IMF funding, the situation could improve. But when it comes to reconstruction, the World Bank estimated that Lebanon needs $11 billion to be able to rebuild after the last war, and this money is nowhere to be found yet. On the political front, the government, meaning...
Before you move on to the political front, sorry. I mean, if you look at the GDP, it's increasing rapidly, but is that because it's going from such a low base?
Yeah, I mean, Lebanon really had hit rock bottom around, I would say, 2022, when the currency really deteriorated in value. It kind of recovered a little bit, but it's still,
When was that explosion?
Oh, 2020. I mean, Lebanon has had a series of catastrophes that affected its economy. First, you had the financial crisis that was mainly due to corruption in Lebanon in 2019. Then you had the port explosion in 2020. You had the pandemic. And then, of course, you had the war between Hezbollah and Israel. And all those things devastated Lebanon's economy in the last, 7 years or so. And the currency, for example, picked up a bit because of remittances. Things have, improved a little bit. But as I said, this is really mainly due to individual endeavors rather than a significant shift at the macroeconomic level in the country. And this is not, a recipe for recovery or growth. But the government cannot do miracles in 1 year. Being able to address the financial gap law is a quite important step forward, and hopefully will also serve to reassure potential investors in terms of doing business with Lebanon. Hopefully, the situation can also reassure some Gulf countries which have not given money, because in the past, the money that they had given, for example, after the 2006 war, went into different people's pockets due to corruption rather than going to the people who need it. So they want to avoid having divergence of aid. The situation, I would say, is not optimal, obviously, but there have been some concrete achievements by this government. And when it comes to politics, which is connected, the Prime Minister and President enjoy wide credibility in Lebanon and wide support. I would say more than 2/3 of the population is supportive of the President and the Prime Minister, with the remaining third still being more on the pro-Hezbollah, pro-Iran side, who again, are divided into those that are being a bit more pragmatic regarding the President and the Prime Minister, so they're not necessarily against them, but their political leanings remain in the opposite direction. So in general, I would say Lebanon has made significant progress, actually, over the past year at the level of the government, but the economic situation is not something that Lebanon can handle on its own.
Thank you very much. Is there anything you want to add, Chris Doyle?
Yes, thank you. I agree largely with what Lina Khatib has said. I would just emphasise that there is a window of opportunity here with this government that, as she said, has widespread credibility in the region but also internationally. Now, that will not necessarily last forever. I think there is a real risk, unless they're able to deliver for Lebanese in a situation where there is inequality, corruption, economic malaise, then that popularity, that legitimacy, that credibility will seep away very fast. And I'm sure we'll come on to it. That also is an issue when looking at the issue of the relationship with Israel to the south, but also Syria. So it's absolutely incumbent, I think, on responsible external actors to support that government, not just through economic assistance, but political assistance as well. Because this is an opportunity for a Lebanese government to land on its own feet without having to be put there, as Lina said, by external powers and so forth, to be almost like a Lebanon first project, where the interests of Lebanese are put first and foremost in determining the trajectory of the country. I think that the weakness of Hezbollah after the 2024 war, combined with the weakness of Iran, also adds to that sense of a window of opportunity. But it won't be open for long. So we need to work really hard. And I would say that part of that is to restrain what Israel is doing right now. We are looking at a situation where they've made, according to UNIFIL, over 10,000 ceasefire violations since November 2024.
We are going to get on that.
But it's important in the context of supporting that government, because if they are going to move forward with these reforms, they've got to be seeing, the public, the voting public, some results, some positives out of it. I think there's also this tying of economic assistance to progress on the disarmament is also, I think, something that needs to be queried. yes, if you make some progress, it's got to be met with some assistance on the economic sector. You can't wait to the end of that disarmament process.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add, Daniel Levy?
And I had two very brief points.
Please do.
Can I first just appreciate your opening comments and join you in acknowledging International Holocaust Remembrance Day and speak, if I, for one moment, for coming from that Jewish tradition when never again means never again for anyone. And so let me commend this committee, but also encourage this committee to do whatever you can in ensuring that international law, international humanitarian law, UN charters, the conventions, including that against genocide, are upheld universally everywhere. And when we're falling short of that standard, to hold the government's feet to the fire on that. On this point, regarding Lebanon, what I hope we will also touch on, following from what Chris just said, is how does one strengthen this ceasefire, which in parts of Lebanon doesn't feel like a ceasefire at all, and prevent another escalation, because nothing is going to set back those economic prospects more than another major conflagration, and I wouldn't take too lightly the prospects of that in this year.
Thank you. Phil, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Chair. If I can start with Chris Doyle. When the current Lebanese government was established, it stated that it wanted to suppress the Captagon drugs trade and tackle the gangs that profit off it. How successful has the current Lebanese government been in that endeavour?
Well, the nature of the drugs business is you're never really quite sure. But what you can see is that because you have a different government in Syria that is cracking down on the drugs trade there, a reminder that Captagon was possibly the largest source of hard currency earnings for the Assad regime, that the Captagon was largely smuggled to the Gulf, but also other countries, but that was their primary market, including via Lebanon. So that cooperation to crack down on the drugs trade has been very important, and of course it then restricts income being earned by groups like Hezbollah that also trades in heroin, cocaine and hash. If you go to the Bekaa, there was an arrest of a notorious drug kingpin who was a TV celebrity in Lebanon back in November, Noah Zetar, and his clan had been running a lot of the drugs operations in Lebanon. So the challenge there again is the strength of central government in dealing with this. Now you can start cracking it down, but in order to sustain it, that government needs the resources, it needs the legitimacy to be able to bring that about. If a large segment of the population in that area in the Bekaa is going to start losing income because they can't trade in these drugs, and I'm talking about the ordinary farmers who use their land here for growing hash, say, then what are their employment opportunities in an economy that is almost non-existent? So we've seen welcome progress. I think that's pleased Saudi Arabia, that's made Saudi more amenable to work with the Lebanese government. It's been one of their demands, and it's had a positive impact also within Syria. So we need to keep a close eye on that, and I think that some of the assistance that Britain has given, for example, in setting up those border posts, is it 84, I think, in total, to monitor that border with Syria, is all very much part of cracking down on that drugs trade. The caveat to this is historically that border is very difficult to keep closed. There's been, for years and decades, smuggler trails across it. It's pretty tough to keep closed over those mountains. So it's not something you can take your eye off.
Lina, Khatib, Daniel Levy, I don't know if you had additional thoughts on how that plays into ensuring stability in the country, but also the point that Chris Doyle was making about economic assistance, and he spoke to Saudi Arabia, but of course other jurisdictions might be thinking about how they can support the Lebanese people and will want assurances about what progress the government is making on Captagon and other drugs in country.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Chris's assessment. There are now a lot fewer Captagon factories than there were just a year or so ago when the Assad regime was in place. And this is a major development because the manufacturing, it's not just the trade, was a big part of the picture. Right now, the trade is ongoing when it comes to mainly the drugs that had already been manufactured that were not yet sold. So that is still ongoing. But it's not at the same scale as before, of course. So we have to be mindful that for Hezbollah, this is still bringing a degree of funding. And the second issue with the border is, of course, weapons smuggling. And here we are talking mainly about weapons being smuggled from Syria into Lebanon, but also the other way around. Because the situation in Syria is such that the remnants of the old regime that have some links with Iran are interested in destabilizing Syria. And therefore, this cooperation when it comes to smuggling weapons is happening in both directions. So if Iran can't dominate Syria, it has tried to be a spoiler. Yeah. So that's another thing to keep an eye on. So whether it's drugs or weapons smuggling, it's very important to support the security sector, both in Lebanon and in Syria, because their capacity is still not at a high enough level to be able to really be on top of what is going on there.
Thank you.
Is Captagon's market Saudi Arabia more than anywhere else?
Yes.
And
it's
that's
principally, and it's very cheap to make. So actually, this is one of the reasons why, Syria under the Assads was able to produce these factories. They didn't need, inputs that were expensive or rare. You can sell it there. So the best quality Captagon tends to go to those richer Gulf markets. The lower grade Captagon tended to go to places like Jordan or even for Syrian use themselves. But it's very addictive. So that's another challenge with all of this.
And that's why you're saying that Saudi Arabia is giving Lebanon assistance to...
It's far more amenable to helping with Lebanon now. It sees that both the Syrian authorities, the new ones, and the Lebanese are cooperating together and trying to stop it, because it's a big problem socially, domestically in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, thank you. Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Levy, you mentioned the importance of strengthening the ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. How would you assess its stability at the moment, considering the frequent violations that Mr. Doyle mentioned?
Yeah, that 10,000 as registered by UNIFIL violations in 14 months. But if you dig beneath that headline, and beneath the headline that Israel maintains 5 military outposts inside sovereign Lebanese territory, what I think is most prominent is the permanent violations of sovereign Lebanese airspace. So that is constant drone surveillance, fighter jets, primarily in the south, but not exclusively. And the extent to which this life under surveillance is the reality for so many Lebanese. But here also, I would argue, what that does to the credibility of the mission of this, as Lina suggested, transformational potential moment. Because there is an inverse relationship in terms of how much the government can achieve, I would argue at least, vis-a-vis Hezbollah, and how much Israel continues to give fuel to that resistance narrative by continuing to bomb Lebanon, which is, as I imagine, quite an obvious point. Israel has been allowed to get away with that. It's not entirely dissimilar to what we see in Gaza, where you have a ceasefire, but every day Palestinians still being killed. Israel, in that respect, in occupation of 58%. So if you want the Lebanese government to be in a stronger position vis-a-vis Hezbollah, you have to see that there is actually the ability to hold Israel back. Now, one thing we've seen, which is quite unprecedented, certainly very unusual, is there have been not open to the cameras, but publicly acknowledged Israel-Lebanese meetings under US auspices between senior officials. The Lebanese sent a former ambassador to the US, the Israelis sent members of the National Security Council, 2 such meetings in December. I think there was a subsequent meeting at a slightly different level in January. However, having gone out on a limb in making those things happen, what we see is a repeated pattern whereby you do now have a reality. In Lebanon, I'd argue also in Syria, where there is an effort to say, you know what, we can have a new beginning here. We've got some support from the outside. The Americans are looking at this slightly differently. Let's try and come to some kind of a modus operandi with Israel. We have significant differences, but let's see if pragmatism on our part will be met halfway. Unfortunately, that's not the modus operandi of the Israeli government, and they're not being pushed to that. So that is met with maximalism on the Israeli side, and I think this is the hard thing for people to wrap their heads around. The project is maintain instability in terms of what Israel is trying to achieve in Lebanon, in Syria, and elsewhere. They don't want to see a strong central government in Lebanon. That would withdraw the justification for maintaining buffer zones in both places.
The mission is maintaining stability.
Maintain instability.
Maintain instability.
Yes, chaos. I think that's where you have a significant divergence in UK interests and Israeli interests, certainly interests of the Lebanese or Syrian governments and state. And the question is, how do you change that equation? And I think it encourages two things. It encourages on the Lebanese side the difficulty in going further beyond what's been done already in terms of asserting one central authority vis-a-vis Hezbollah as well. And it encourages on the Israeli side the sense that how much more can we get away with? How much further down this regional military domination path can we go? In the lead up to the new year, there was a lot of talk on the Israeli side of another major military operation against Lebanon. That is in abeyance. I would argue certainly in the context of an election year in Israel. Don't be surprised if that comes back into play.
And who would that military operation be against? Because, of course, Hezbollah has been weakened intensely after 2024's attack. Are they, I mean, I don't know the situation there. Is Hezbollah rearming? Are they planning other things? Is that a fair reflection, or what is the situation there?
Yeah, so yes, it would ostensibly be against Hezbollah, but what one sees, especially if the major area of operation is not in the south, and at least according to UNIFIL again, the UN forces, there is not evidence of Hezbollah rearming south of the Litani, which is this what is held as that line and what was supposed to be achieved in the first phase. I'd be surprised if the government had achieved everything, but it's clearly gone much further than in the past. Those strikes on Hezbollah can be very pinpointed, but they also can be extremely destructive well beyond Hezbollah targets. So people may be familiar with the term the Dahir Doctrine, which is the neighborhood in southern Beirut, and it's something that Israel has used elsewhere as well, which is you destroy the entire neighborhood, you destroy the civilian infrastructure, and that's the worry if one goes back to that.
May I just present a bit of a different reading? I've been going to Lebanon every month for the last few months, and I was there just earlier this month. And every time I go, I see small progress when it comes to the issue of disarmament of Hezbollah. There's a lot of public criticism that disarmament is not going quickly enough. However, the Lebanese army is not making a huge public fuss about the achievements in that regard because they are very sensitive about mainly the Shia community that is still supportive of Hezbollah. Now, not all the Shia community is supportive of Hezbollah, but the elements of the Shia community that are supportive of Hezbollah, the government is aware that they don't want this issue to be turned into a sectarian tension situation. Yep. So they are achieving a lot more than what is known in the public domain. When it comes to Hezbollah itself, unfortunately, the group is also trying to court that community, that is its hardcore supporters, by trying to present things as business as usual. And part of that is trying, whenever they can, to move fighters or move weapons, and sometimes manufacture new weapons. But this is happening on a very small scale. Israel is, of course, monitoring all this. So operationally speaking, even though there is this degree of movement by Hezbollah, which is mainly aimed at appeasing its local support base to show them that we are still strong militarily, we still have capacity, this does not operationally threaten Israel's security to merit a wide-scale attack. And I think this is why, one of the reasons why this wide-scale attack that was anticipated in around October, November actually did not happen, because Israel wouldn't benefit operationally from it. And if Israel had actually attacked on a wide scale and destroyed infrastructure, then this would damage the credibility of the Lebanese government that is currently there, that is very much aligned with Israel regarding disarming Hezbollah. So actually it is in Israel's interest for this government in Lebanon to succeed and to be seen as credible and to be receiving as much international backing as possible, so that the disarmament of Hezbollah actually happens. And so personally, I don't think that Israel is going to threaten Lebanon in that way. And all the attacks, and I've been really tracking where Israel has been striking, those 10,000. I would say that it's a process, it's a strategy of gradual degradation of Hezbollah militarily, because Israel is basically attacking sites where Hezbollah stores weapons, or incidents in which Hezbollah personnel are moving around, or where there is transfer of weapons. Now, unfortunately, Israel doesn't seem to be too concerned if, for example, civilians happen to also die in these attacks, or if civilian...
127, right,
Sorry?
is the number. 127 is the number of civilians that have been killed, according to the UN.
So this is what's going on. So the way I'm observing shows me that it's not that Israel is targeting the civilians, but Israel doesn't seem to mind if civilian deaths happen as part of its objectives in these strikes, which of course is unfortunate. And it's not something that the Lebanese government has been silent about either, and it's something that is being brought up again and again by the authorities.
I think we might have to move on, but one more question before we do. So these strikes, the killing of civilians, the 5 outposts that we're seeing inside Lebanese territory, how is all this compatible with the UN Security Resolution 1701, with international law? And I see Mr. Doyle has his hand up, so maybe you can answer that.
I was actually going to come on to 1701 because it would appear that, I think it was the 8th of January, the Prime Minister of Lebanon announced that south of the Litani, Hezbollah was no longer operational, and the Lebanese armed forces had sole monopoly of power. Now, largely, I think that's true. There hasn't been evidence to say that it's, not. And I think that what we do not see is, on the other side, some reciprocal measures on behalf of the State of Israel, either to remove its forces from the 5 positions that it holds in Lebanon, to stop the violations of the ceasefire. It's a ceasefire in name only, but even reduce them. But in fact, they've been escalating in the last few months. So I think that we're way short of this. And it troubles me also that in 12 months' time, the UN mechanism to verify and check this UNIFIL reaches the end of its mandate. And we have no idea what will go in its place, which to my mind is crazy, given, if you look historically, as what has happened across that border, that you don't have a responsible international mechanism to try to deconflict, try to cool matters, which UNIFIL in the past has done on many occasions. So I think that's very important. Just briefly on what Daniel said on fragmentation, it has been actually a long-term Israeli aim within Lebanon, going back to the days of Ben Gurion, to try to fragment Lebanon, to reach links particularly with the Maronites. This is not new. And it has been approaching also Syria in a similar vein. It has undermined the new central authorities. It has tried to support the Kurds, the Druze, also to prevent a strong, unified state within Syria. In terms of disarmament and where are the weapons, they've been obviously the strategic weapons, the main ones probably hidden in the Bekaa to the north. It's going to be very difficult to get to this disarmament. So we've got this problem coming up because getting Hezbollah out of the south is one thing, but how do you get to disarm Hezbollah without, who is going to do this? The Lebanese armed forces aren't strong enough, but also if you get the Lebanese armed forces to do this and you push them, as some are trying to, then you are putting them in an unenviable situation because they're meant to be a national institution that is meant to be there to defend all Lebanese regardless of identity, and they will be pushed towards what will be seen as a civil conflict. So we need to be very wary of that. It will be devastating to Lebanon. I think the final thing I'll just mention is also the push, particularly by the Americans and also the Israelis, to normalization of relations, actually both with Syria and Lebanon, way before two pretty weak governments, populations that are still traumatized, that are still coming out of conflict and economic trauma, are ready for it. I think that we should be looking at how do you get to a situation of non-aggression and various deconfliction agreements, but without pushing them much faster than politically they can afford to do at this juncture.
I want to ask Richard to ask some follow-up questions because we're going from one of our military experts to the other now.
Chris, you talk about how this could be really quite difficult if the Lebanese armed forces seek to remove and decommission weapons from Hezbollah. Elsewhere, where we've seen a monopoly on armed force, a monopoly on violence happen in pursuit of stability, that's happened because there's been an integration of militias, of fighters into some sort of, they might maintain their identity, but they are part then of the national armed forces. So how is this disarmament and demobilization program different?
Well, I was referring to a situation in which it would be done by force. The alternative would be some sort of political agreement where, as you say, that those who've been fighting with the Hezbollah could sign up to the Lebanese armed forces. Bear in mind that Hezbollah pays more. Historically, you don't get paid very much in the Lebanese armed forces, so there's that issue. Hezbollah is a provider. But when you look at this, you've got to have a way in which you're going to convince Hezbollah to do this. There's going to be a lot of fears within the Shia community. So we give up our weapons, but Israeli forces are still bombing every day. They're still occupying Lebanese territory. That will be, you can argue, the excuse that they will hide behind, but it actually will attract some degree of sympathy amongst its supporters. That if we are going to make such a move, we need to see progress. Now, there is a catch here as well, that if Hezbollah is still armed and you open up discussions about political reform in Lebanon, then Hezbollah will be an armed actor with a disproportionate weight in discussing how the cake will be shared up in Lebanon. They would like to see more Shia representatives in the Lebanese parliament. So it's a very difficult process there of trying to persuade Hezbollah, and a divided Hezbollah leadership, a much weaker Hezbollah leadership, let's face it, to do this. And it, rather than pressing to timetables, etc., I think to appreciate that there has to be a political negotiation, that this would be better if external forces were outside of Syria, outside of Lebanon, and that this could be resolved internally within Lebanon.
Can I just add a very important point, which is Iran? Unfortunately, this is not internal within Lebanon. Iran is the decision maker right now for Hezbollah. There was
even
in
now.
Lebanon.
Even now.
Iran now. Meaning when the former Secretary General Hezbollah was still alive, Hassan Nasrallah, there was a degree of decision-making at the level of domestic politics that Nasrallah was in charge of. With him gone, the decisions right now, politically as well as militarily, in Hezbollah are very much those of Iran and the IRGC in particular. This is how the group is running at the moment, because Israel has decapitated several levels of leadership within Hezbollah. And this actually is a drain on Iran's own capacity. I mean, I always give the simile of if you're the CEO of a company and you have to run different departments yourself, then this is, obviously a drain on your resources. And this is what's happening with Iran and Hezbollah right now. But this means that Hezbollah will not disarm for as long as the regime in Tehran continues in the way that it is today. Because Hezbollah is a very important card for Iran, and for as long as this regime is in place in Tehran, Iran will not want to give up on the privileges that Hezbollah has inside Lebanon, and arms is what gives Hezbollah political clout. And that is why Hezbollah has been so stubborn. Because Iran doesn't want it to disarm, and Hezbollah itself doesn't have the agency anymore to make decisions of that kind. So the way I see it is, at the moment, the Lebanese authorities are doing what they can under the circumstances. And Hezbollah is also being stubborn to gain time, because there are meant to be elections in Lebanon in May, parliamentary elections. And Hezbollah knows that if it hands over its weapons now, it will lose the support of the hardcore community that I was talking about earlier. And it doesn't want that. So it's trying to hold on to its weapons for as long as possible to retain this political standing, even though it has been greatly diminished. However, if the situation in Iran changes, then Hezbollah will no longer have the external backing that it is using to flex its muscles. So I expect that when the situation in Iran changes, this will have a direct effect, not an indirect, but a direct effect on the disarmament issue in Lebanon and on the status of Hezbollah. And maybe then we can see some pragmatists accept a political deal, as Chris is saying. Maybe some others will want to be spoilers, like we're seeing in Syria with remnants of the Assad regime. But I think the issue of Iran is crucial in Lebanese domestic politics.
If I may, thank you. I would draw you back to something, I was looking through the notes, something you heard from a former state minister here for the Middle East in one of your previous hearings, where he made that point of not having a cardboard cutout, overly simplistic view of Hezbollah and its relationship with Iran, and not to ignore its internal rootedness in Lebanon. So I would probably question some of that. What I would say is, if what we just heard is more accurate than that previous minister's portrayal, that I think raises some very worrying potential short-term questions if we do see a further American intervention militarily against Iran. Because then, if that's true, one would expect Hezbollah to do its worst in response to such a thing. What I would also say is I align with how Lina previously just depicted in response to me what was going on internally in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Where I would part ways is your interpretation of Israeli intentionality and what's going on the Israeli side. What is happening in terms of Israeli politics, Israeli coalition politics, and that it's insufficiently satisfying in the Israeli political arena to quietly be hitting these targets in the way that you described, and in terms of what they're trying to achieve there. And I worry that, as we've seen elsewhere in the region, if you do have an Israel treated with impunity, then, especially under this coalition, in an election year, that's the impetus to do more damage inside Lebanon. And I would argue the way you address that, of course, is you insert accountability into the mix. You don't allow impunity, and there are many ways that can be done.
This is so interesting. Can I ask another question, just abusing my position as chair? Yeah. If you have, though, I mean, if what Lina is saying is right, that the connection between Iran and Hezbollah remains strong, and that Iran continues to pull the strings, why was there no response in the summer when Iran was bombed from Hezbollah? Because there was nothing.
Because Iran did not want them to, because that would bring more damage to Hezbollah standing in Lebanon than doing nothing. So it was a matter of choosing the lesser evil as far as Iran was concerned. Because at that time, the ceasefire had already happened in November 2024, and we had mass displacement going on in Lebanon. And to have this community go through yet more hardship due to renewed fighting would have cost Hezbollah a lot of its, let's say, outer circle support within the community. Because, of course, the hardcore supporters will, still rally around it, but it would have cost it politically. And this is not in Iran's interest. So at the moment, the approach that I'm seeing is to hold on to the fragments that they still have in terms of Hezbollah's political standing in Lebanon. So that's why they did not intervene.
If I can, I think you've precisely highlighted the difference between the relationship remains strong, which I agree with, and pulling the strings, which I disagree with. Because if it's hard to explain why, if we consider Iran to be significantly on the back foot, they wouldn't think that this is the time, which is what you're implying in your question, Chair. We don't really care anymore about your domestic equities, Hezbollah. Our support for you is there for a reason, and this is D-Day when it comes to us. Which I think, if part of that explanation is accurate, I think it should lead us to step back, pause, take a deep breath, and understand that the Iranian regime is almost certainly more resilient than many people would like to depict it.
Happy. Yep. Abdesam.
Thank you, Chair. So I want us to go back a few steps to the discussions that have been taking place in December between Israel and Lebanon. And, a number of you have referenced the fragile ceasefire, the lack of ceasefire, the ceasefire just by name. How might we get to a position where there is enforcement of the ceasefire, where discussions around normalisation can begin? If at all that ever is a possibility in the future. So I'm keen to hear your views in that particular area. What's the purpose of these discussions if it's not going to lead to peace? And particularly keen to hear about what it will mean in an election year for Israel as well. So I'll start with you, Mr. Levy, and then on to the others.
Thank you. So I think with a strong American encouragement, it was testing the waters as to, and I go back to something Chris said, can you put some of the building blocks in place to have a degree of predictability and regularization of some things on the Israel-Lebanon front? And I'm intentionally not using the word to normalize, because I think that word now carries such a baggage with it. We saw the Abraham Accord normalization. Many people were terribly enthusiastic about that. I'm not attributing causality to what happened in the Abraham Accords and then what happened in Gaza October 7 and Israel's response to it. But they certainly didn't help us. You certainly couldn't deploy those relationships with Israel to try and get a de-escalation on the Gaza front. So I think on the Lebanese side, it was not dissimilar to what we've seen in Syria with the Ashara regime, where you've had the foreign minister directly meeting with Israeli ministers to test the water and say, okay, we're being encouraged to create an element of predictability in this relationship. Where can we go with it? I think what they have seen, and again, I would say that this is fueled, encouraged by Israel's sense, unfortunately, they can get away with anything, is Israel putting such a maximalist position on the table that you couldn't, as a Syria or as a Lebanon, in your political realities and in the regional political realities, and with the images from Gaza still fresh in everyone's minds and still being added to, you couldn't go anywhere with that maximalism. And so those things haven't, I don't think, even laid a foundation for very much. Maybe the smallest elements of a pre-foundation. So I think what you have to do is try and get both sides to adhere to the terms of a ceasefire, which sounds like a really obvious and reasonable thing. What worries me is that in the context of UNIFIL leaving at the end of this year, what are you going to have there? And I don't say that in the context of someone who thinks a UN force should stay forever. I mean, this was established in 1978. The intention should be to wind it down. But what other mechanism will you have? Will it be a multilateral mechanism that's legitimate in different parties' eyes under international law, or will you see slippage in the direction of what we've seen in Gaza, where there's a civil military and coordination center inside Israel, overseen by the Israelis and the Americans, not under any kind of international multilateral UN umbrella, where you have the idea of an international stabilization force, but it's not come about, it's not actually happening, and where you, I just want to cast people's minds back because it's so pertinent to the last few days. Everyone was okay with the Board of Peace when it was just something to be imposed on Palestinians in Gaza, right? The Board of Peace, everyone endorses it. They go to Sharm el-Sheikh for the summit, including our own Prime Minister. We vote with that UN Security Council resolution, as did everyone else except for the two permanent members, Russia and China, who abstained. And it was okay in a UN Security Council resolution to create this sui generis body owned and led by one person who could decide everything that happens. Suddenly, when we woke up and read the Charter of the Board of Peace, it didn't say Gaza anywhere, and heaven forbid it might be applied to Ukraine and Greenland. It's like, wait a minute, we don't like this so much. This doesn't have any international legitimacy. If it doesn't have legitimacy in West Asia, Middle East region, it doesn't have legitimacy at all if it doesn't have legitimacy for us here. So I think, in short, all parties will need to be held to the ceasefire.
Thank you. Mr. Doyle, if I can ask you about the regional countries as well, Saudi and Qatar, whether they've got an additional role to play in trying to de-escalate the situation.
I think the regional countries can do that. Saudi has improved its relations with Lebanon. There's no question about that. The UAE has started tentative relations for a long time. They were very sour, even to the extent that the UAE banned its nationals from going to Lebanon. What? This was a couple of years back. So last summer there was a meeting and they agreed to try to push things forward. The UAE had a very anti-Hezbollah position. The Qataris have just announced quite a large sum of money in terms of assistance. So they do, see that they can play a role and try to shore things up. But they are not confident in the political process at the moment. And so if you have a situation where the ceasefire is being violated every day, that reconstruction can't happen in the south, because that's the reality. 27 villages were destroyed, 100,000 buildings destroyed or damaged. Then they're not going to plough money in. They're not going to plough money in when there isn't greater transparency, as Lina Khatib referred to earlier, the corruption. They want to see that there is a mechanism by which, Israel is not just able to bomb Lebanon, areas of Lebanon at will. And that, I'm afraid, is what we're seeing at the moment, both in Lebanon and in Syria. And they look at what's happening in Syria as well. They are, they see the way that they bombed the defense minister in the middle of Damascus. Nothing happens. And I have to say there is a huge degree of silence, including from the UK, on some of this. Where is the statements that Israel should withdraw from the territories it occupied in December 2024 in Syria? Nothing. Where is the statement about withdrawing from the territories it's occupied in Lebanon? These should be insisted upon, but there is no accountability for this. So all the accountability goes on to Hezbollah, the Lebanese side, or the Syrian actors, and Israel is let off. And the region sees that. And I think they're not going to invest, just as they won't invest in Gaza, if there isn't a proper political mechanism that they are reassured and they have confidence in, which will mean that in 4 or 5 years' time, there isn't another major bombing of Gaza and flattening of it. That puts them off. They're not going to continually refund the reconstruction of these areas unless there is a proper model and a proper system of accountability on all sides.
Lina, did you want to come in?
Just on normalization. Not too long ago, that word was basically taboo in Lebanon. And invoking direct talks with Israel would have landed someone in Lebanon with a prison sentence for treason. This is no longer the case. The special representative who is representing Lebanon in the negotiations with Israel has himself said that he would be willing to go to Tel Aviv to negotiate with Israel had he been given the mandate to do so by the president and the prime minister. This kind of approach reflects a wider sentiment. And again, every time I go to Lebanon, I kind of hear more and more, just, in wider society, expressions that people are just tired and they just want to get on with life. And unfortunately for a lot of Arab ideologues, there's also this tacit acceptance that the cause that they thought they would win has not quite succeeded, against Israel's superiority in the region. And they feel that, pragmatically speaking, this is where the region is now. And there's no point in being ideological and saying, no, we're going to always regard Israel as an enemy because, we are Arabs and we are, on the Palestinian side in the cause. They are saying, well, we would have, liked to say we won against Israel as Arabs. However, the situation is very different now, and we have a different configuration of geopolitics in the Middle East. And if we're gonna move on, we need to try to rebuild our country, and in this case Lebanon, according to the current variables. And Israel has shown that it has this US backing that has transformed it into a regional agenda setter. And so the public sentiment is changing. The government, of course, in Lebanon will not normalize, just like that, as we just heard from, Chris. There have to be all kinds of long-term peace mechanisms at play for the government of Lebanon to embrace normalization, and this includes, of course, crucially, a peace deal with the Palestinians. However, there are now talks of something in between, perhaps, which was never the case before. Before it was, as I said, very absolute. And so, there is space right now to be creative in terms of policy, to kind of move things forward in a way that may not be called normalization, but that would bring stability to both Lebanon and Israel.
Alex, you wanted to come in?
Oh, yes, thank you, Chair. So several of you mentioned the need for accountability. Israel's military activity in Lebanon and Syria going across several lines. What do you think the UK should be doing to ensure that accountability? What should we as a committee be recommending to ministers? Sorry, Mr. Levy first.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm so sorry. May I just? I'm just watching the time, and we've got probably about half an hour or so, and we want to also talk about. Want to kind of, if you don't mind, take advantage of the fact that you're here and ask you a little bit about Syria and about refugees. So if we can just hold back a bit of time to be able to do that too.
Thank you, Chair. So I do think that if you fail to assert accountability in the circumstances of Gaza, you're unlikely to do so in the circumstances of Lebanon. And it's the broader signal that sends. One of the things that I think is well overdue, and I hope it's on the radar screen of this committee, is that we still haven't had a response of the government to the July 19th, 2024 International Court of Justice position on Israel's permanent occupation of the Palestinian territories and the responsibilities of third-party states in that respect. I understand that opinion exists inside the government. I do hope that that's something you will find cause to ask, when are we going to find out? 18 months after the ICJ has made a ruling on an issue.
It's one of the things we asked for in our report. And so if we're doing a catch-up, then we can ask again.
Great. I note that in the case of brought by the Gambia to the International Court of Justice regarding Myanmar on violations of the Genocide Convention, the UK government at the time did see fit to submit its position in support of the Gambia's appeal to the ICJ on that issue. There is a South African case. There were already urgent provisional measures issued by the ICJ in January of 2024, which were robustly ignored by Israel. So I think that's something that the UK could join as well. If I go specifically into Lebanon and how some of this plays out, I do want to draw attention to something which isn't automatically associated with Lebanon, which is UNRWA, the UN agency. UNRWA does operate in Lebanon, and outside of the Palestinian territories, UNRWA's operation in Lebanon is in the Palestinian community under the most precarious circumstances of existence, where UNRWA's role is most indispensable. Why? Because of the historic situation of the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, where they do not have permanent rights in Lebanon. They're not allowed to hold most jobs. They're not allowed to open businesses. The state does not provide services to Palestinians. So everything depends on that role of UNRWA. 230,000 refugees, 61 schools, 34,000 children in those schools, 29 primary healthcare centers that UNRWA runs in Lebanon. A 20% cut in the budget of UNRWA across the board means 20% cut in salaries and in services provided also to that community inside Lebanon. And feeding into the earlier conversation, what does that mean? There are a mosaic of armed groups in the camps. There are now young people who are going to have even less opportunity, even less things provided for them. That's fantastic recruitment ground if you want to look at it from that angle. The British government, credit, has resumed funding to UNRWA. I don't know if that can be increased further. I don't know if we can lean further into pushing back against the there's this constant attempt to denigrate UNRWA. The evidence hasn't been provided. The UN set up a commission under the auspices of the former French Foreign Minister, Colonne. It came out with findings that didn't corroborate what Israel was claiming, but it also came out with recommendations that were taken on board. So I think that is an issue that really matters. Of course, just like UNIFIL, I don't want UNRWA to exist in perpetuity. UNRWA shouldn't exist in perpetuity. But what you need to end UNRWA isn't a scurrilous attack on UNRWA and making the lives of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon or elsewhere even more miserable. What you need is Palestinian self-determination, Palestinian rights to be recognized, to return, to restitution, etc. But this is a very ugly campaign. And just to finish this little thing, at the same time as the Board of Peace was being launched in Davos, the UNRWA headquarters in East Jerusalem were being bulldozed.
I know.
And the deputy mayor of Jerusalem...
There's a lot to talk about on that. But
if I can share this one quote, because people should pay attention to these kinds of genocidal statements. The Jerusalem deputy mayor, Aryeh King, declared, "With God's help, we will expel, annihilate, and kill all members of UNRWA, a UN agency."
Mr. Doyle.
I just wanted to follow up on UNRWA as well. I totally share what Daniel said, but it's also, as we're going to talk about Syria, it's an issue there too.
Yeah.
And we saw 40% of Palestine refugees being displaced over the last 14 years. Many of them actually went to Lebanon. Actually, Palestinian refugees from Syria within Lebanon probably had the worst lot of all, because they actually fell in between UNHCR and UNRWA. They had less rights than pretty much anybody, and in visiting them, their situation was perhaps the most vulnerable. So when you see the cut in resources to UNRWA, it will affect the situation in Syria as well.
And Fleur.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to echo your comments about Holocaust Memorial Day, how important that is, a context here, but also, and a couple of drawing attention to my register of interests, that I visited Lebanon with a cross-party group of MPs in 2022 with the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and I visited Israel and Palestine with Caabu in 2023. I would like to talk further about refugees and about the destabilising influence and results of the numbers of refugees that are in Lebanon, which are pertinent to everything we've been talking about and to the prospects for peace, and also the different types of refugees there are and how able the government is to deal with the refugee situation. So first of all, on the numbers of refugees, in a population of about 5.5 million people in Lebanon, there are about 2 million refugees. So how many are there now? If I can come to each of you in turn, you don't have to answer all of these questions. So what are the numbers of refugees? How many Syrian refugees are there? And how many Druze refugees are there as well as those who are Palestinians? And I've been to some of the camps that you talked about, Mr. Doyle. They're not really camps at all, are they? They're towns that have been in existence for decades now. So number one, what are the numbers? The number two, how well is the Lebanese government dealing with the refugee situation in its territory? I met with ministers from Lebanon, from the previous government when I was there, and I asked about the refugee situation. And the government minister's answer was, refugees, there are no refugees. There are people who come and go, but there are no refugees in Lebanon, which was an extraordinary moment, but really was an indication of how well the government was coping with the refugees. So how is it now? And then what should the FCDO be doing for the refugees? There are lots of children there in those camps that I know that UK agencies like Save the Children are working with as well, but what further could the FCDO be doing to not just have a defence-focused support for Lebanon, but a humanitarian, and then going on to economic recovery, the state capacity, but in relation to refugees. There's a lot there. So, Mr. Levy.
I'm going to come at it from an angle that doesn't cast light on your on your question regarding numbers, because I don't have them at my fingertips. I would just say the following. I do think, as others have pointed out, that this is a government in Lebanon that, on many of these questions, wants to do the right thing. And something which really pains me is something that Lina said before, is I welcome what you said about a different possibility of accepting Israel, and that's why the disappointment of Israel not being able to step up to that is so bitter. But so I think when it comes to a lot of these humanitarian things, a government led by Prime Minister Nawaf wants to try and do the right thing. Now think about it. Think about the political capital that already frail government would have to expend to have a bigger program of investing in, welcoming, how you put resources at the disposal of refugees. And then I just ask this committee to think about something in this respect. How strong a case do we have, and I think this is what comes back to the UK government, how strong a case do we have as a UK government in saying, how are you treating your refugees? How are you treating asylum seekers in Lebanon if we're not doing right in terms of our responsibilities to people coming to this country? And that's just the thought I would share on that.
Yes, I think just to follow on what Daniel said, I mean, put in the context that Lebanon hosted 1 million Syrian refugees, quarter of its population were refugees. That's a real refugee crisis, and it's remarkable how many people do not understand that of the 5.5 million Syrian refugees, most of them landed up in the region. It was the richer middle-class Syrians who managed to make it into Europe, who had the resources, etc. But most of them, went to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Turkey. And actually,
layered on top of Palestinian refugees.
Top of Palestine refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. But also that actually the internally displaced in Syria had even worse conditions. So we had 6.5 million IDPs in Syria, in some of the most appalling, because they were beyond any international assistance in many cases. And that internal displacement is still continuing. We've seen it in some of the fighting in the north and the northeast in recent weeks. And then you have also the people who weren't actually able to move because they were frail, elderly, who actually had to stay in areas that were under siege. So the issue of displacement in what's going on, and I remember being in Syria in 2006, hosting huge numbers of Lebanese refugees who were fleeing the conflict of that year. So that's just to put in that the experience of mass displacement in these countries dwarfs anything that we have in our experience in recent times. The situation with refugees has unfortunately, for historical reasons in Lebanon, become toxic. I remember being out there at the start of the Syria refugee crisis. They didn't want UNHCR to refer to refugees. There were people who fled the events in Syria. They didn't set up formal refugee camps. That was also toxic, so you never had a Syria refugee camp. You had Syrian communities, often on farmland, etc. And initially, Lebanese communities were very welcoming. But of course, it was a drain on their resources. When I met one mayor of a municipality, he said, look, half my population are now Syrian refugees. I have limited resources. We have to collect rubbish. We have to provide electricity and water. In a country that was subsequently, of course, hit by the banking crisis, had its own problems even before that. So it's been a huge, huge challenge for Lebanon. And of course, they brought in their own issues from Syria. The war was still going on and all the struggles and the tensions there. So it's been a monumental challenge. There were, unfortunately, and they still exist, an element of the Lebanese political system who want to forcibly return them. That exists. I remember the previous foreign minister lecturing us here in London on this, saying, Syria refugees need to go back when it wasn't safe to go back. And even today, and I'd add a word of caution here, that Syria is not even in a recovery phase yet. 9 out of 10 Syrians are in dire poverty. There are not the levels of infrastructure to provide for the return of many of these refugees, yet within some of these countries, of course, there is a big and understandable, I get it, desire to see those refugees go back to Syria. But they're not yet ready. We have also, and this has not been commented on so often, because of what's been happening in Syria to certain communities, and you mentioned the Druze, there has been an outflow of Syrians into Lebanon as well as some returning. I think UNHCR says that there's 1.2 million have gone back to Syria generally overall, not just from Lebanon, but there has been also a large number, I think it was maybe up to about 200,000 maybe. I'll have to come back to you on the exact figure, who have left. And they've left, some of them Alawis, some of them Druze, and others because they don't feel safe.
You say on that, and in particular, what should the FCDO, would be the best sources of funding, support for economic recovery, but also some of the humanitarian support which would address this refugee situation in Lebanon to bring more stability?
Well, certainly economic recovery is desperately needed. The thing, as we just heard, is that just because there has been a change politically in Syria doesn't mean that the Syrian refugees will be able to leave Lebanon. I mean, I was also in Syria in December, and the level of devastation remains huge, and the government simply doesn't have the resources. And so in Lebanon there was wishful thinking that now the Syrians will go back, but that has, as we just heard, has not really happened. With this new government in Lebanon, as I said, the expectations are very high, but the resources remain constrained. So I would say economic assistance that cuts across not just the Syrian refugee or even the Palestinian refugee population, but Lebanon in general, I think is very much needed. In addition, civil service reform, which I know is not a very, attractive topic to many, but is needed because in Lebanon you have a government which has very good, capable ministers. However, their ministries are still populated by civil servants from the old guard. And it has happened on many occasions that the ministers would issue ministerial directives that do not get implemented because the staff in their ministries simply refuse to cooperate. So, and this is also an issue for the refugees because of the Ministry of Social Affairs in Lebanon that handles a lot of the refugee-related funding and other issues. So it's not just a matter of give Lebanon more economic assistance, it's also, can we also help Lebanon with the reform process that is needed at the level of the state institutions in the country to be able to deliver this funding appropriately.
Can I move on to obviously a issue which is very much related to that which Fleur has been raising, which is what is happening in Syria. I mean, Lina Khatib, you said you were there in December and there's still an awful lot to do. Can you give us your assessment of the current situation in terms of the stability of the government that has been set up?
Yeah, I mean, I should say I was invited by the Syrian government to visit and speak at the very first public conference that the Syrian government had organized. And the theme of the conference was challenges and opportunities of Syria's political transition. And I thought that was a positive step, that they invited Syrians and non-Syrians to speak publicly at this conference and speak rather freely, I will say. And a lot of important criticisms were made at that conference, mainly by the Syrian experts who were invited, which I thought was a good sign that the Syrian government is at least giving space to people to express criticisms of the government in a government forum. This doesn't happen in many places, especially in the Arab world. So there is scope for at least a discussion. But when it comes to the capacity to actually translate ideas into positive action, there is a lot more that needs to be done in Syria in that regard. There is a distinct lack of capacity within the Syrian government. Not everyone is really capable who's in positions of decision making. A lot of the work is now being done bottom up at the level of the grassroots, civil society, but also at the level of the experts in the different domains, the economy, other industry kind of domains, agriculture. You have people coming together in the business community to try to make a difference, feeling that they now have an opportunity to act and they want to do their best. So a lot of the positive change is not to do with the government in Syria and its own vision and capacity, but to do with the Syrians themselves who want to use every opportunity to improve their country. And so I think what we can do is work with these Syrians who are genuine about improving Syria, but at the same time working with the Syrian government to address this issue of lack of capacity, because both are needed. So when it comes to longevity of the Syrian government, I think it's a matter of treating this situation as being short-term, because this is not a sustainable model for growth. So now we have an opportunity, as I said, to act on those two levels. But we can't assume that this situation is going to last forever. Because again, just like with Lebanon, even if you have good leaders, at least be part of a particular new government, if they don't deliver, then you're going to have complications. So that's my assessment.
And do you believe it is the intention of the government to try and build an administration that incorporates and includes all the different religious and ethnic populations within Syria, and to what extent is that, do you think, happening? Chris?
Yeah, perhaps I could have a go at that. Declaration of my interest. I have in-laws in Syria, so I follow it day and night. I think there is a really serious issue about inclusivity. I think that particularly the president is very good at saying the right words, the right things, particularly to an international audience, and I think we have seen President Sharar doing very well on the international stage. I don't think many of us predicted he'd land up in the Oval Office and have this sort of bromance with President Trump, that sanctions would be lifted so quickly, that he would be able to engage with pretty much all the regional powers, with the exception of Iran, that he notably has not. He's also engaging with Russia, and I think he's about to go to Moscow. But I think if you look around Syria, and I think there is a Damascus bias to this, where so many diplomats and others go to Damascus, but there are differing trajectories in different areas of Syria, in Aleppo or Homs, that where they've experienced the conflict and the new government somewhat differently. You don't see confidence that there is going to be great inclusivity. There was a lot of anger at the Constitutional Declaration of March 2025. It didn't point to an inclusivity. It pointed to a president who actually constitutionally, even as an interim president, given himself more powers arguably than Bashar al-Assad constitutionally. There wasn't enough there to open it up, including in the way that the new assembly would be appointed. He gets to appoint 70 out of 210. We have seen, the massacres last spring along the coast. Maybe 1,000 Alawis were killed. We've seen what's happened in the north, and of course in Sueda, which was, particularly with the Druze, was, awful stories that come out of there, spoken to people on the ground and people who visited as well. So I think they've got to do a lot of convincing on that front. But there's other issues here. Security sector reform is vital. At the moment, the military and the security services, there's almost a certain Iraq element to this, that they folded up conscription and said no more conscription. They folded in the militias that were supportive of them, and they are not recruiting from communities that they don't like or they're suspicious of. So the army, the armed forces and the security services do not represent the full national spectrum of Syrians in their different guises. And if you're going to get Syria going forward, that is absolutely essential. There's also a lack of transparency. For example, there's a sovereign wealth fund headed by the president. Nobody really knows what happens with that money. The banking sector needs serious reform. You need a lot to happen in order to get investment into the country. So whilst they've worked very hard internationally, I think domestically they've got a long way to go in terms of giving people real confidence. There is an opportunity, but we have to be really pretty wary of it. And, they do have a background, of course, Islamist background, some jihadist background. There's still jihadists in the center of government. And instinctively, they don't trust people outside of their clique, because that's how they operated. You knew that there would be other parties who would be trying to infiltrate them. So even when they do want to be inclusive, even when they do want to act, their natural instinct is not to. And that, I think, is really problematic. We see quite a lot of demand among Syrians for a more decentralized approach. And I'm not talking about federalism here, which is what many, for example, Kurds would like, but one that at least allows, in Homs, in Aleppo, more control in those cities over their own affairs. And it's a very centralized, quite authoritarian government. And a lot of the authority is invested in one man. If the president goes, there is no nominated successor. I think his security situation is still pretty precarious. This is not a situation of great stability. As I say, you can go into the middle of Damascus and it all looks quite pleasant, and shishi cafes and restaurants. Go further out, you get a very differing, look at things, including in the northeast. Not surprised at many of the things that have happened up there. I would like to say also on the northeast just one thing, that the situation in these prisons and camps. This security failure that was entirely predictable, that...
And we predicted it.
Yes.
You predicted it. I think we all predicted it. And the failure of countries to realise it, the idea that you hand over responsibility to keep, ISIS detainees with a non-state actor who doesn't have the resources, that we weren't prepared to take some of these detainees back to our home countries and, burden share, is quite, astonishing. And now we have people who escape. We don't know who, how many, what will happen to them in going to Iraq. And there's also many women and children who shouldn't have been in those camps, who had nothing to do with ISIS, who possibly have been more radicalised. This was utter recipe for disaster and should have been stopped right at the beginning.
I'm particularly concerned about one of my constituents who was trafficked when she was 17 and had 2 children. One has survived. I don't know where she is. And we've written to the Foreign Secretary about it, but there's not alone. And being a member of British Parliament, is worried about people who used to live in their constituencies and what is happening to them now. And whatever it is they've done, for them to be treated in this way now is really shocking. Really, really shocking.
You have covered actually a number of the areas which we wanted to ask you about, but just to say a little bit more about the northeast and the Kurdish region. Is the Syrian Democratic Forces, are they still in control, or have they been essentially repressed? And going back to our topic, what does this mean for Lebanon as well?
The Syrian Democratic Forces, I think, overestimated their position. They didn't realise the way things were going. I think they were caught out by the fact the United States pulled away from them, so now they're in a very precarious position. They cannot really push back against the Syrian authorities. But the question is, they're quite divided up there. There are going to be those who will want to resist this. They are very fearful. When I was in that area in April, the fears that resulted as a result of the massacres on the coast were widespread, and pretty much whenever you talk to anybody, that if it can happen to the Alawis there, it can happen to us. So they're very fearful. They do see a lot of these fighters as jihadists, as Al-Qaeda, as ISIS, and sympathetic to them. Whether that's true or not, that is a widespread fear. Against that, the SDF is far from perfect. You see a lot of pictures of Öcalan. The Turks will say PKK, etc. But it's a very dangerous security situation. And I think the danger here is that Damascus gets ahead of itself, that there is a feeling that we've won. And we've seen this actually quite a lot over the last 12 months. We, the Sunni Arabs, have won. There's a sort of sense of win-lose. We've won. We want to have our prize in winning. And I think there's a danger there in the northeast that will be the case, as opposed to trying to really find a political solution that really will give confidence to those communities that they are not going to get penalised, discriminated against, arrested, rounded up, and that their rights really will be respected. Yes, the president talked about Kurdish rights, talked about getting, the language rights and so forth, citizenship rights, very important. The question will be to them, will he follow through? Will this actually be enacted in practice? And on that level, I think there's quite a lot of doubt in that, but that's where we can come in as Britain to try to insist that happens.
Can I just ask you about Kobani? Because it's a sort of Kurdish town that I think is still under siege, is it, or not?
It is, although some convoys as of the weekend have got into Kobani. I think there's some people there who, are scared and wish to fight out, but obviously I'm not on the ground. It's Kurdish majority right up against the Turkish border. I would be, concerned. I hope that they reach a political agreement, because that really is the only way forward. And if you have to look at the north of Syria, hoping that you get a political agreement, and also eventually, there's 2 countries that are, what I would call predatory powers in terms of Syria at the moment, Israel and Turkey. Israel is occupying parts of Syria to the south, and Turkey is occupying parts of Syria to the north. And eventually, just as in Lebanon, I would like to see, the external actors, withdrawing and pulling out. I'm not naive, that's not going to happen quickly. But the real risks at the moment is that you will sow the seeds of ethnic hatred and tension between Turk, Arab and Kurd unless this is sorted out with a credible, legitimate political deal.
Very little to say, except to lean into the last point that Chris made, and I think in that respect, it was not obvious what has just happened. I mean, I think eventually the SDF and those camps, that was obvious and foreseeable, but the fact that Trump, I think, has essentially gone along with seeing this now as a Turkish sphere of influence. Going along with that project on the SDF. And I think Turkey is the only actor. While I agree with your depiction of the two predatory powers, there used to be other predatory powers active in Syria, but it's been whittled down. But in that respect, Syria is a priority and there is capacity on the Turkish side. And I don't think that applies to the same degree. On the Israeli side, I think that was a capturing of territory, of opportunity. And so for me, it goes to a place where Syria is one of many spaces where how do we try and encourage an approach which is not about zero-sum outcomes? The thing that I think has captured many people's attention and imagination is that speech of the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, in terms of what does it mean to now acknowledge the shortcomings, the fiction of what we thought was this system that we were all part of, and how do you rebuild something? And I hope the UK is an active partner in trying to rebuild a multilateral, global set of rules that are adhered to universally, and an architecture for a multipolar reality.
It's a whole other inquiry.
Yes, perhaps.
Just, I think what I just like. I know you have a supplementary, Fleur, but let me just push the time a little bit, because I think we need to kind of ask the final question, really, which is about last year when we did our inquiry. The Lebanese government said that it appreciated UK assistance, particularly in defence and security. And I wondered if there was scope for expansion of cooperation between Lebanon and Britain. And if you wouldn't mind, just sort of relatively quickly, just so that we have it as bullet points about that. I mean, in response to our report, the government said that it had been providing a lot of support for Lebanon, and I think the question really is, have we done enough, and specifically, what else ought we be doing? So, if you wouldn't mind, just addressing that, say relatively quickly, and then.
I think my question is part of that, rather than being an extra one. Go on, then. If I could, thank you, Chair. I would just add the very successful work that the British have done in demining areas of Lebanon and releasing them back to the community to use, and whether anything you would add to what should the FCDO be doing in terms of demining as well.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the security sector, because this is very important. So on my last visit, just earlier this month, I found out that the Lebanese army doesn't have enough capacity to deploy south of the Litani, and this is a problem. And the local population is demanding this. They're saying, well, we're south of the Litani, we don't see enough presence for the Lebanese army, and that's because of capacity issues. As Chris mentioned, the salaries of the army are abysmal. Sometimes people can't afford transport to go to the bases where they're supposed to be deployed. I mean, it's that dire. And so supporting the Lebanese army, we've done a lot in terms of training, in terms of, but they need more personnel, and they need better capacity at all levels. So I would say this is, for me, a crucial and very urgent issue.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know that the British government is particularly proud of the support that they have given to the Lebanese government. I mean, they may not be they've only got, I think, one person in UNIFIL, isn't it? But the support given to the Lebanese government, to the Lebanese army, has been the important thing. But to hear your evidence about they're not having enough money to get the bus is pretty shocking. Yes.
I mean, obviously, Britain does have a shed load of money to throw at these issues at the moment, so there's going to be a limited amount that we can provide in addition to what we're already doing. So I think what they've done helping the Lebanese armed forces is fine, and indeed UNRWA, I hope they stick with that support. But I would say that they need to give, as I said earlier, I'd emphasise this, political support for the Lebanese government, particularly in the disarmament that sees Israel back off in the sort of ways that I outlined earlier, and that we should be present. I think at times we have taken our eyes off both Lebanon and Syria, and that, I think, is not the right path forward. I think we should be honest about some of the failings of the American administration. I mean, they've got rid of so many of their specialists on these countries. And Britain, I hope, can be a voice of reason, but we need to be present. I would urge more visits inside Syria, particularly to allow diplomats to go beyond Damascus. At the moment, I think Germans have been up to Aleppo and Hama and Homs, but British diplomats are restricted. We need to be out and about. We need to be engaging with them, to help and find ways to help. I think in Syria, the resumption of British Council operations, for example, would be very welcome. I think there are things we can do. Technical expertise, I think particularly Lina mentioned capacity. They need the capacity. They need help. I mean, these guys were running a small province of Idlib at best before, so they've lost a lot of that capacity for governance. I think there are questions as to how open they are to receive that advice, receive the technical capabilities, but we should still be pushing it.
Very good, very good.
And I mean, first, let's acknowledge that many of these things the UK can't solve. You know that. Secondly, some of the good things that we can do less when the FCDO aid and assistance and budget is less. So I'm telling you things you're very familiar with and dealing with across so many issues. Two specifics in the explanation of vote remarks that the British Perm Rep at the UN gave when there was the unanimous endorsement of continuing the UNIFIL mandate until the end of this year, which is basically a way of preventing a precipitous ending of UNIFIL, which the Americans at the time were pushing for. In explaining that vote, the UK Perm Rep said, if we want to guarantee a transition to Lebanese armed forces control, we have to make that possible without Israel controlling swathes of Lebanese territory and violating Lebanese sovereignty. So what is the government, and it's some of the things, Chris, even just pointing it out, what is the UK government doing to make good on the comments and explaining that vote? And I was just looking back on what the Lebanese ambassador said when he was before your committee, the former ambassador now, when he was before your committee, and he made the point that all theatres of operation in the region are connected. So you can't have, you can't neatly put a seal around Lebanon and say, well, this is the approach just to Lebanon. So I think it's the overall approach to the region and de-escalation in the region
very good.
Yeah.
Can I thank you all very much for your time today? It's been absolutely fascinating. If there's anything else that occurs to you, you're very welcome always to write. And the committee will be very, very glad to read your thoughts. Thank you all very much for your time and for your expertise and sharing it so generously with us today.